Welcome to this panel discussion, Committing to Clean and Green Shipping. My name is Goddard. I'm editorial director of the Economist Group. So last month's COP26 has been a stark reminder, I think, that while the shipping industry, at least parts of it, are moving in the right direction with decarbonisation, and shipping, of course, accounts for between 2 and 3% of global carbon emissions, there is still a large leap in progress needed in the industry and across the supporting infrastructure, technologies and value chain if we're going to get shipping emissions down substantially and of course to net zero by 2050. More ambitious targets from the regulators in the International Maritime Organization, I think, will be essential. Shouldn't net zero by 2050, as I was just saying, be the minimum aim there? And of course, national governments also have a critical role to play in the raising of ambitions. To this end, what progress has been made by the shipping industry, by governments, and across the broader value chain in Asia-Pacific in the transition to cleaner, greener shipping, and how might progress on decarbonisation be accelerated? So let me welcome three very distinguished speakers to help us navigate these issues. Cheng-Mount, who is chairman of the Yanmar Marine Transport Corporation, a Taiwanese container shipping company. Sabrina Chao, who is president of BIMCO, the Baltic and International Maritime Council, one of the world's largest international shipping associations. And Nixon, who is chief executive of Ocean Network Express, a Japanese container and shipping company. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for joining us today. So let me begin, if I can, Cheng-Mount, if I can. I'm not sure the World Ocean Summit has heard a great deal from the shipping industry in Taiwan. So it's a great pleasure to have you here to tell us a little bit about that. Yeah. Really, on your plans for green shipping, despite it, your plans for green shipping. So let me take this opportunity and just ask you what plans are underway at Yanmar.
Thank you for this opportunity for me to introduce our company in regarding to this issue. Yanmar currently ranked number 9 in the global shipping industry, and we are very carefully pay attention to this COP26 meeting because we think this issue is very important to us. And as to your question, I think our company has made a promise to reduce the carbon dioxide by the 2013 to 15%. And so far, our company has already achieved that goal. By the end of last year, the carbon dioxide, the intensity, we already reduced by 56%. So we already achieved that. And our current planning is that, first of all, we need to introduce all the concept to our colleagues and also reintroduce the process, including the shipbuilding and also the operation. And so we want to incorporate this COP26 spirit into our production line, and that's our current program. But the key issue is not regarding in the new shipbuilding because there's a technical issue and not so many ship company has agreed on this in the future. But otherwise, we focus more on the process, reduce the speed of our ships, and also enhance the operation efficiency in our operation, and also redesign the ship shape so they increase the efficiency and reduce the fuel consumption. And that's the current process.
Thank you very much. Lots of things that you're doing in the interim to try and increase efficiency in the ships. Yes. Have you actually started ordering vessels that would be capable of running at zero emissions?
Yes, we are currently studying very hard on this. So all the ships in consideration, including the LNG, methanol, and also the final solution, hydrogen, and also the ammonia. But all these are just in consideration because we think the final solution has not been able to put into the market. So I guess recently the most available fuel would be LNG, would be our consideration in the near future.
Thank you very much, Cheng-Mount, and I'm going to come back to you to all of those questions in a while because they raise very important issues. Sabrina, if I could come to you. Some argue that the shipping industry is moving much too slowly when it comes to decarbonising, and I partly suggested that in my intro, but others too are saying that the industry is in fact moving ahead and is well on its way to with a range of initiatives to help decarbonize the industry. Could you help us sort out which one it is? Where are we?
It is important to appreciate that decarbonizing the maritime industry is a joint effort by governments, fuel providers, technology providers, and of course our industry. In the main, the maritime industry is keen to move towards zero carbon and is exploring different alternatives for retrofitting to existing ships and for new buildings, as Mr. Chang just talked about. But without the availability of zero carbon fuels and the availability of the necessary infrastructure and the availability of the required technology, as well as global regulations that ensure a level playing field, the industry at this moment has few options that may be used in the near future. So as we saw in COP26, there is not universal agreement of governments towards decarbonization. But it became very clear during the meeting that the industry will move ahead of the governments. As the CEO of Clarvenes said at one of the conferences, business and private sector is moving faster than policies and regulations. Hence, IMO regulations will not trigger the kickoff of the transformation, but be critically necessary for a global scaling of it. In this respect, and as a related issue that describes the situation, it is very likely that the end of the use of coal for energy will come through lack of finance rather than government regulation. So, it is a very difficult question, but I think, it just comes to show that, all the companies within maritime industry, as Mr. Chang just alluded, we are looking at all different kinds of solutions and, trying to put our heads together as to what may come first. But we also have to bear in mind that because of the nature of our business, it requires joint efforts outside of just ship owners. It requires governments, it requires service providers, infrastructure providers to really come together. And most of all, green fuel, where they will come from and whether it is an alternative, a possible alternative, and that will come into a pricing issue as well.
So, I mean, it's very difficult to answer that question with a yes or no, isn't it? As you suggest, it's a complicated situation. Jeremy, I just wonder if I could jump to you briefly and just see if you would agree broadly. I mean, is it? It's not a yes or no, is it? But is the shipping industry moving quickly enough? Which side do you fall on that question?
Thank you, Charles. I think the first thing is, as the two previous colleagues have mentioned, that this is a really difficult industry to actually decarbonize, to abate. We're similar to the aviation industry. We're very carbon intensive. We're offshore. We can't just plug into electricity grids. And actually, we have to have very carbon intensive fuels at the moment to the calorific nature and the size of the ships. However, I do believe that as an industry, we have a lot of collaboration now working together, trying to find solutions with the classification societies, the designers, the engine manufacturers, the yards, and a number of companies have made significant progress in at least defining and developing some dual fuel solutions, which would not only minimize the existing carbon intensity of existing ships, but give the option to allow new green fuels as and when they become available to be optimized and used on the ships in the future. And that's really the way we need to go. I think the second point is that we're very, very fortunate that we have the UN body, the IMO, and the IMO is actually the regulator and legislator and the ultimate party that will define the regulatory requirements for decarbonisation in our industry. And we all have a lot of lobbying with that entity, and we are trying to reach a consensus. And although COP26 at the global level didn't really come out with anything too significant to move the needle, we hope that the MEPC IMO discussions and meetings which are coming up, that we as an industry can make some really forthright and clear directions on R&D fuel surcharges, on market-based measures, and on a range of other issues to reduce the carbon intensity of the existing ships and move towards these new fuels.
Let me come to that in a minute, if I can, because I do want to ask you about the IMO. And I thought, Sabrina, your thought, or the thought that you quoted, were around the IMO triggering the transformation, but will be critical in accelerating was an important thought. But Jeremy, can I just ask you? You mentioned COP26, and it's come up a couple of times. It sounds like you were disappointed by the outcomes. There were one or two that focused around shipping. What do you feel were the important outcomes of COP26 for the decarbonisation of shipping?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the overall global framework, clearly multilateral cooperation is probably not at its highest at the moment in terms of the global political landscape and economies. But we as shipping should not be held back from that. And while major breakthroughs couldn't be made in Glasgow, I would say that the discussions that we had amongst the shipping industry, which we did have in Glasgow and I was part of, were very, very informative and very useful. And I think, and I would agree with Sabrina's comment, I believe now industry is ahead of government now, and that we shouldn't overly rely on government, and we need to move on anyway as an industry and really now try to work at the IMO level to get new global regulations, new global standards, and new clarity in and around the future market-based measures and further fuel levies to come. Because one thing that shipping needs is a global, predictable, universal form of regulation. So as we know, we should not be overly relying on COP. That's more of a global political development, and we should be concentrating more on what we can do within our industry. And I think the cooperation and the general building towards that is pretty good at the moment. There's a lot of initiatives going on, collaboration at the technical level and across different trade associations, classification sites, etc. So that's good. I think what we really have to do is concentrate more on the IMO, which is effectively our mini COP, which looks after the whole of shipping as a regulator and actually defines the technical rules around ship design, ship emissions, and future revenue-based carbon taxes, etc. And that's really where we have to make the progress. So those that IMO MEPC sessions, which are based in London, those will kick off again very shortly. And those 170 governments have to really work at the technical regulatory level to move forward. So we'll do a lot of lobbying with those countries to try to make sure that we can push ahead, because I do think now that industry is ahead of government, and we need the government now to put a sensible framework in place, which is a global, predictable framework that we can all work to decarbonize our existing ships and to look to how we can accelerate the use of these future green fuels into our dual fuel technology ships.
Thank you. Cheng-Mount, I just want to pick up, if I can, you mentioned COP right at the very beginning, COP26, and do you feel that there was, I mean, as Jeremy is saying, at some level, COP, the real COP is for shipping is IMO, and that's going to be largely the negotiations around 2023. Do you feel that COP26 nevertheless did come up with anything that was going to be a signal for shipping?
I think it's probably a very good commercial for people to realize the seriousness of the climate change. And I guess there's more of the educational. But for shipping, I agree with Jeremy that actually our shipping company already progress more slightly advanced than the government agenda. And so in this regard, like some other country in Taiwan, we try to like promote the concept to our government. This is a cooperative work among all industry, not just for the shipping industry. And most important, the government regulation must be clear and consistent, because the shipping industry rely on the future regulation to set up our goal. So if the regulation is not clear for our shipping industry, it's very difficult for us to comply with those regulations.
Sabrina, if I could just pick up there as well with you. I mean, there was something thrown in the way of decarbonisation of shipping, and that was the Cheng-Mount declaration at COP26, which is calling for at least 6 green shipping corridors by 2025. But nevertheless, I thought that was a very modest, only a very modest move. What was your thoughts? Were you reasonably encouraged or disappointed by the outcomes of COP?
I think, to be honest, I think it is in line with expectation. But going back to my original saying that, a lot is up to the industry now to do, and, with the world being so complicated these days, we can't really expect, a very drastic coming together in a way. But I think that's where the IMO really has a role to play, just picking up on what Jeremy said earlier. And I think we do have to look onto the IMO to make sure that their strategy is on track, so that, the industry's ambition on carbon reduction, on decarbonization will be on course in a way. So just to recap a bit, the IMO's initial strategy on the reduction of greenhouse gas from 2018 has set the course, and especially in relation to the short-term energy efficiency measures. But now it is crucial that the IMO agrees on a comprehensive plan by 2023 as planned. And the revised strategy will have to clearly steer the entire industry in the mid to long term in relation to energy translation. And, we have a MEPC coming up end of the month. There's a lot to be discussed, and I'm sure, COP and the Cheng-Mount declaration will be discussed at length about about how to put that into action in a way. So there is a lot to look forward to, and there's a lot of work to be done, and we know that, and there's still a lot of uncertainty that needs to come.
And does the IMO 2023 process need to result in a clear statement of intent and ambition on the part of the member countries that the IMO is going to deliver the framework that will allow net zero shipping by 2050? Yeah,
well, when it comes to IMO and the discussions, it's very hard to predict, the outcome. But I think for sure that, for every country at the table, nobody is ignoring the fact that this Earth, our planet needs to decarbonize. But it is, really down to the details of this discussion, market-based measures versus levy, and, what kind of, how do you really measure certain things, the R&D fund, for example, how will that come into play in terms of new technology coming in? How will that be administered? These are all part of, the discussion has been ongoing at IMO for a number of years now, and these are very complicated issues. I mean, we also have to respect, that these are very important issues and very complicated issues, and not all the countries will see eye to eye and as to the interpretation of these sort of things. So I think we just kind of need to have faith, and that's why we have meetings like COP26 to make sure that we are on track, and there are certain guidelines and strategy that will come into play. So rather than sitting here and really, predicting on the outcome of IMO, I think, as an industry, we can just sort of be there, and definitely for BIMCO, we are there to support the IMO in terms of the development of all these measures that will come into play.
Jeremy, if I could just sort of ask you that as well, before we move on to talking a little bit more about the detail of both the national government sort of responsibilities and commitments that are needed, as well as the industry ones. Can I just ask you on the IMO, what are the risks? I mean, the IMO has disappointed, in my view, for quite some time now. What are the risks, do you think, of there not being some sort of agreement around net zero by 2050 in 2023 at the IMO negotiations?
Yeah, I think the IMO at the end of the day can only be as strong as the 170 government members that attended and define its policy. So I think the IMO is a very capable entity. It's the right entity, and it needs the backing and support of these 170 governments to come to the table and listen very clearly to what industry is saying, and ensure that that at least meets the COP26 objectives for the industry. And we're already pushing the IMO to do more, in fact, in terms of specifically two key things. The first is that we want this R&D fund made available, which we will self-finance as an industry. So we would put $2 per ton on fuel oil, and we would collect that money centrally at the IMO level, and that would collect about $5 billion, and that could be used as an R&D fund to help us finance a lot of these collaboration projects, which are already happening, and create an R&D pipeline. And this is not a market-based measures. This should not be confused with market-based measures. This is simply a self-finance R&D fund. So that's number one. We need that, and we need the IMO, please, to sign off on that and get that through and get that up and running. And the second item is more around market-based measures and this understanding that we are going to go towards net zero by 2050. The IMO has not committed us to that yet, but there are many people across the industry, including my company, including the Getting to Zero Coalition, which are saying that should be the ambition. Let's get to net zero by 2050, and let's speed up the framework requirements that are needed by our industry to be able to encourage a faster transition to these decarb fuels for the future.
Cheng-Mount, can I just pick up from that
Yes.
and just sort of ask you from Yanming's point of view? I mean, as Jeremy said very clearly, there's quite a lot. I mean, from a point a few years ago when many in the shipping industry and around it felt or said that there was no plausible way to get to net zero by 2050. But now there really is a strong consensus amongst at least some of the shipping industry that it is possible to get to net zero by 2050. Although obviously lots of things have to align. How do you feel at Yanming about that?
Yeah, compared to several years ago, I think there's more possible way to achieve that goal. In our company, I believe, as I mentioned earlier, the most important is the concept and actions. And the concept we try to educate our colleagues is to let everybody understand the whole process of the carbon footprinting process. So this issue is not just about fuel, but about all the process which we could generate the carbon. And second process we try to do is concrete actions. So not just as Jeremy mentioned in the IMO, in all the technology, we have been chipping in for the funding of the study. We also try to figure out how to do the carbon neutral, because instead of the carbon reduction, I guess the current available fuel would not be able to do the carbon reduction 100%. So there's another way for the carbon neutral, like for example, planting more tree in the forest. Currently in Yanming, we even study how to generate more forests in the ocean. That is not just generate the carbon reduction in the land, but also in the ocean. That's currently we are studying it.
I want to just pick up, if I might, from that and come to you, Sabrina, and then to you, Jeremy, in this sense that, you know, obviously policy measures need to be put in place by national governments in order to be able to accelerate the process, and in particular to make zero emission shipping the default choice by 2030, as you well know, Jeremy, the Getting to Zero Coalition is suggesting. What do governments need to do to put that in place? We've spoken a little bit about you know, clear decarbonisation targets for domestic shipping, for meaningful market-based measures, which I assume to mean a carbon price or a carbon tax. Sabrina, what do governments urgently now need to do in order to be able to help that framework get in place in order for private sector to be able to move?
I think that there we have to be cautious, to be honest. I do agree that, of course, you know, every nation should have their own sort of like, you know, getting to zero policy. But at the same time, as an industry, especially as a maritime industry, we are all advocates for a level playing field. The last thing we need is, you know, a ship pulling to this port in this country and then going to that point in another country, and then you have a whole different set of regimes and requirements that we have to comply. And that is just one, logistically a nightmare for us to organize. But at the same time, it's just not practical. So I think as BIMCO and as an organization representing ship owners from all over the world, we are definitely advocating for a level playing field. And in that regard, you know, governments should come to the table and exchange notes, and also to, you know, with a lot of the countries are represented through IMO anyway. So I would advocate for all these national members belonging to IMO to come together and support, you know, and use IMO as a platform to come up with plan, especially for international shipping anyway, and that it is a practical, you know, solution can be pushed out, you know, for the industry that will, you know, promote sort of harmony instead of chaos.
I think Sabrina raises an important point, Jeremy, about harmonization there. Obviously, at one level, we want to see a carbon price or a carbon tax or something of that sort as a market-based measure in place, but one wants to also to make sure that it isn't very confusing and difficult across the world as it's done. I mean, the European Union is clearly going to set a price around carbon that's going to be rising over the course of the next decade. Where do you stand on that? What meaningful market-based measures are you looking for, and how do you want to see them implemented?
Thank you, Charles. And first of all, I totally agree with Sabrina, and I'm sure Cheng-Mount would agree. I mean, as an industry, we rely on common standards. Our ships trade in every different part of the world, 170 different countries in the world. And look at container shipping. Container shipping is all about standards. We have the same size containers, same size container cranes, et cetera, et cetera. We start changing that around, it's very difficult, very confusing. So we need to have one standard universal approach, which is transparent and predictable and universally applied. So we have a level playing field. What I would like to see is a market-based measure coming in, which would be based around a levy per ton. So I'm not talking about the R&D fund I just mentioned earlier on. That should go ahead anyway, but we need to see some type of market-based measure coming in where a cost per ton would be applied on fuel in the future. And that should only kick in as and when we can start deploying decarbonized ships. So, you know, it's certainly the ability to build dual fuel ships right now. We're not going to see any ships coming out of the yards till 2025. So maybe you could start something off from then. But secondly, it has to be on a per ton basis, because that way it's transparent and it's clear, and it's also clear to the customers in the supply chain as well. If we start going off down this idea of having carbon trading and credits and debits and different option prices, this gets very complex and very difficult to understand and to measure. And in terms of that fuel cost per ton, it needs to gradually ramp up in line with the needs of the industry to support the first movers. So what do I mean by that? We have 60,000 ships out there today. Only 5% of those ships could be replaced or renewed per year. So this is a 20-year journey to retool the whole of the global shipping industry. Today, we have 300 million tons of fuel oil being consumed. People are talking about a $100 CO2 carbon tax. If we apply that to fuel oil, that equates to about $300 per ton. So if you go out tomorrow and start collecting $300 per ton on 300 million tons of fuel oil, you'll create $90 billion worth of tax. That's a huge tax on the global supply chain. And actually that amount of money is not needed because actually only 5% per year of the industry can retool. So if you said, well, let's just collect what we need to collect to incentivize those 5% that are converting, you would only need a $15 per tax in the first year, going to $30 in the second year, going to $45 in the third year. So you gradually ramp it up in line with the ability of the industry to transition. And you keep that money for the first movers who have to invest in this technology and take the technical risk of applying, ammonia solutions or methanol solutions or hydrogen solutions.
So you're saying that a levy per ton instead of a carbon price, an overarching carbon price, is what the shipping industry needs to have the right incentives to be able to move, but only from 2025 when you're starting to see those ships capable of dual fuel use in place. Can I just come to you, Cheng-Mount? I mean,
Yes.
I put the obvious question there, and that is to say that actually shouldn't that levy, if a levy is indeed the right idea, be in place a little bit earlier so that the incentives are there for the shipping industry to actually move more quickly?
Yes, I do believe levy of the carbon tax, simple and clear, would incentivize the industry to move faster. Because let's take our company as one example. Right now, we are considering building new ship. But what kind of ship we are going to adopt? Traditional fuel or the new green fuel? But you know that building the new green fuel ship will cost more. So if a levy of carbon tax would help us to put more resources on the new green fuel ship, definitely this would be an incentive.
What are the other, I mean, briefly, and I want to also make sure that we come on to this question of, how the shipping industry itself can start to sort of move quickly, but I mean, it is in some respects doing that. But just the other mechanisms that governments and national governments, because clearly, Sabrina, you said earlier that one wants to try and align these and make sure that these are not going to create a lot of confusing and inconsistent regulations and standards across the world. But what is it that other governments could be doing? What is it governments could be doing in order to try and to push this forward more quickly beyond market-based measures? What do you feel they should be doing? We heard of green shipping routes, of course. That's one possibility.
Yeah, I think, we also sometimes have to bear in mind that, yes, our industry needs to decarbonize, but as to many industries out there as well, So the availability of these green fuels or alternative fuels will come into play. I mean, after all, if you look at sort of like our carbon footprint, we represent like 5% of the carbonization. And there are industries that create much bigger percentages than we do, and and they are also in need of the same green fuel that we are talking about as well. So in that grand scheme of things, then where will shipping sit? And hence that will come into sort of something that we need to think about, the price gaps, etc. And I think that's a role that the national government can play and start paying attention to. That the whole world, as a whole nation, goes into decarbonization, and everyone is looking at the same fuel source. How do you distribute the source, and what does that mean for the cost of going green? And I think that is something to always be bear in mind. And I think there is something that is to be said about governments coming together and sharing notes about sort of about their strategy on this. And of course, that will trickle down into our industry as well.
And I think that's the whole question of fuels is a really important one here. And I mean, so to the question that we were beginning to raise, and we're going to look at this question of what the industry can be doing, and whether it's first the fuel or first the ships, which is always a question that I mean, certainly the fuel industry is saying that they need to see signals from the shipping industry that they're buying the ships that they're creating the alternative fuels for, and to some degree vice versa. Jeremy, how do we set that in balance, do you think, and how do we ensure that both are moving forward quickly together?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and it is the chicken and egg big question for us as an industry. We're going to need a lot of green hydrogen in the future from renewable energy to be able to then convert those hydrogen atoms either into pure hydrogen for the ships or into ammonia, or even potentially for methanol as well, green methanol. So the availability of that is limited at the moment. There are a number of countries, as we know, at COP26 who are making some quite bold statements about how much green energy they can produce over the next 5 to 10 years. And that's very encouraging. I think the key thing, though, is we are many shipping companies, including O&E right now, who are looking at future investing. We sit there at the board level. We need to make sure that whatever ships we are investing in are future-proof. They may not immediately be working off decarb fuels, but at least we know in the design of the ship that we know exactly how it could be retrofitted later on, as and when these fuels become available. And those ships, as Cheng-Mount has rightly said, cost a lot more money. So we need to maybe look a little bit at what has been done in Europe, and particularly in the UK, to support the offshore wind industry, for example, where you give the first mover the comfort that if they go ahead and make the investment, that the difference between the market-based price that they are going to get for their electricity versus the actual cost of producing that electricity is covered through a support mechanism provided by government. And we need something like that for the shipping. But I'm not proposing that the government would pay for that support mechanism. I'm proposing that, we're proposing, as we just discussed, about having a market-based measure which will collect funds, and those funds could then be used to support those companies that are going ahead with that new construction in those new ship technologies.
Cheng-Mount, is that kind of mechanism the kind of mechanism that you think you might support as well, in order to be able to incentivize the players to be able to move forward, particularly in the development of the fuels, as well as, of course, the development of the infrastructure and the bunkering and everything that needs to go along with that?
Yeah, of course, I support those measures. And besides that, I also propose to all the governments, it's not just the cost is very important factor, but another factor is a stable supply of the green fuels, because ships need to park at all the ports. But if all the ports does not provide the necessary infrastructure, like for example, currently there are only a few ports they can supply LNG. So even if we try to build the LNG ships, we have only limited port we can park. So they would limit our capacity regarding to LNG ships. So as long as the hydrogen and ammonia and methanol in the future, I guess the stable supply or the necessary infrastructure provided by the government is all a very important factor for us to continue to supply the green fuels.
And finally, a word on that yourself, Sabrina. I mean, it's interesting to hear that you're considering LNG as an option, because that clearly is a fossil fuel, Cheng-Mount. But I mean, not being an expert in these areas, I have to be very, very careful what I say here. But I mean, what do you think are the fuel options of the future, Sabrina, and how are we going to get them into ships and get ships being made to take those fuel options relatively quickly? Because 2030 we have to start making those ships by 2030, don't we? Because those ships will last for another 20 years or 30 years beyond this.
Well, I think, that it is hard to predict which will emerge as the winner, to be honest. I mean, like, everything that's been said today, ammonia, ethanol, methanol, hydrogen, nuclear is another one. And I think right now, as an industry, we should look at all the possibility out there. And, and there are, I've been to a few conferences lately, not the COP, but like previously as well. And you and I, Charles, sat on a panel together as well. And it is interesting to see, as you talk to various different owners out there, that they all have different strategies on this. And of course, wind cell is another technology that we are looking at, and that will definitely help with our carbon footprint. So I think for now, it is important for owners and stakeholders coming together and to share notes on the development on each. And for example, nuclear is another one. It is a technology that's been out there, through submarine for years. And why are we not looking into that? Is there a safety concern, or what are the concerns out there? And I think we should just put all the options out there, and as an industry, come up with something that we think are operational, that is commercially viable, and and then we will also address what Cheng-Mount just said, the supply issue as well. That it requires a much closer collaboration and note sharing in a way as to all kind of technological advances that everybody is making.
Well, we have sadly come to the end of this discussion. I have to say, it's really, and I've been in and around these discussions for a little while. It's very encouraging, I think, to see the industry thinking in the way that we've heard our three very distinguished panelists talk about. And obviously there are tremendous challenges ahead still, and acceleration still is needed. And it's complex, but it strikes me that somehow governments now need to start thinking about some of the mechanisms that need to be in place in order to really set the framework for this transition. You said earlier, right at the very beginning, Sabrina, that from the IMO's perspective, it wasn't going to be the trigger of this because it sort of lost that space in a sense. It didn't act in time, I think. But it could be critical in accelerating it. We all wait for 2023 certainly, and what happens in that process. But we also want to see national governments, I think, moving a little bit more quickly in and around this space. I just want to thank our wonderful speakers. I thought that was a fascinating discussion. Cheng-Mount Cheng, who's chairman of Yanmar Marine Transport Corporation, should I say, from Taiwan. Sabrina Chao, president of BIMCO, and Jeremy Nixon, who's chief executive of Ocean Network Express, ONE. Thank you very much indeed for your time.